On May 15, 2006, a 34-year-old English engineer named David Sharp froze to death near the summit of Mount Everest. Over the course of that single morning, roughly 40 different climbers walked right past him. They saw him huddled inside a small limestone crevice. His limbs were freezing solid and he was entirely unable to move, but he was clearly, visibly still alive. This creates an immediate, disturbing question. How does the basic human instinct to save a dying person completely vanish on the world's highest peak? Down at sea level, the reaction to those 40 climbers was immediate and brutal. Global media outlets condemned the passersby for prioritizing a summit photo over a human life. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to conquer the mountain, expressed sheer disgust at the news. In his view, there was no excuse. He stated that on his expedition, there was no way they would have left a man under a rock to die. Critics blamed summit fever, a psychological state where the drive to reach the peak becomes so fanatical that it overrides rational thought and moral consideration. The debate centers on whether 40 different people suffered a simultaneous collapse of ethics, or if the environment of Mount Everest simply strips away the ability to apply them. Frostbite at this altitude is a physical absolute. Look at the blackened tissue on these fingertips. This is the necrosis Sharp was already familiar with. He'd lost parts of 2 toes on a previous attempt, yet he returned for a third try in 2006. For that final climb, Sharp made a series of compounding, high-risk choices. He decided to climb completely solo, he refused to hire a Sherpa, and carried less supplemental oxygen. He wanted a pure, unassisted achievement, and another climber had suggested that lugging heavy, redundant oxygen canisters would only tire him out faster. By stripping away every safety net, Sharp engineered a mathematical scenario where any physical failure would be instantly fatal and nearly impossible to rescue. At 1 a.m. on May 15th, the first group found Sharp sitting in a cave, his eyelashes covered in ice. Because he wasn't moving and his oxygen mask was off, they assumed he was already in a coma and continued on without radioing for help. 20 minutes later, a second group shouted at Sharp to get up and move. He didn't speak, but he reportedly waved them off. When climber Maxime Chaya reached him later that morning, he realized Sharp was still alive, even though his nose was black and his fingers were frozen solid. Chaya tried to give Sharp oxygen, but his partner insisted it was hopeless. After reciting the Lord's Prayer, Chaya was forced to continue his descent before his own oxygen ran out. 2 hours later, 2 Sherpas spent 20 minutes attempting to drag Sharp into the sunlight. They only stopped when it became clear he was completely immobile and could not be moved further. Double amputee Mark Inglis also passed Sharp that morning. Inglis himself was in no condition to help. He was struggling for survival and eventually had to be carried down the mountain on a Sherpa's back. These encounters suggest that many of the 40 passersby didn't coldly ignore Sharp. They engaged, realized they lacked the resources to move him, and were forced into a choice between his life and their own. This diagram shows the death zone above 28,000 feet. Oxygen levels plummet into a fatal red zone. The body actively dies, reserves depleting like an hourglass. Moving an immobile body requires 6 rescuers, as gravity drastically multiplies dead weight. Attempting a spontaneous rescue of an immobile person at this altitude without a dedicated team is a suicide mission. The perceived moral failure ignores a physical reality. At 28,000 feet, the capacity for rescue often simply does not exist. While the public and the climbing elite continued their condemnation, the person with the most right to be angry had a different perspective. Sharp's mother, Linda. She explicitly defended the climbers who passed her son, stating that no one should have to risk their own life to save someone else. Her public stance, "Your responsibility is to save yourself," suggests that those closest to the tragedy understood the ruthless math of the mountain better than the observers at sea level. David Sharp remains on Mount Everest today. His body was eventually moved off the main path and out of sight, permanently entombed in the ice. Sharp's story reveals an alien landscape where the rules of human society and morality cannot survive the altitude. Beyond 28,000 feet, human ambition ends, and the absolute limits of nature begin.